Hi guys, and welcome back to a very dusty workshop in Japan. In the last video, I did manage to get the body shell of the beetle in primer, but I actually have been getting on with other stuff as well. So here are the rear wings. I did actually have to put a lot of work into these. As you can remember from one of the previous videos, these were badly beaten up. There was quite a bit of filler work involved, the resin coat, and also I have managed to prime them. And it was pretty much the same story with the front wings. There was a lot of body working, trying to get all the imperfections out these. They were badly damaged. And with the bonnet, where I blocked it down, I did find some imperfections. I'm not quite happy with this just yet, so a little bit more work involved, just getting this straight, just so I can put some more primer on. And as for the primer, unfortunately, I have ran out, so I've ordered some more. It should be here soon. Then I'll be able to finish the bonnet and the deck lid. So what's next is I need to guide coat the whole of the beetle shell, and then I can start blocking it off ready for paint. So when doing body work, there is a lot of sanding involved, and I do actually have a whole selection of different grades. So far we've been using a 180 and a 120 grit just to get the vehicle shaped, and also I used a 120 to 180 on the resin coat. But when preparing the primer ready for paint, I do actually have to drop the grade. I'll be using something like an 800. So the next process of getting this primer ready for paint, I will actually be doing dry sanding using 800 paper. But what you can do is you can use a wet sanding technique and wet flat the car using clean water and a block. You can use a wet dry sandpaper, or you can even use a wet dry sandpaper on your DA. So whether you're wet flatting or dry sanding the body shell, it's totally up to you. You can use both methods. I have done in the past, but for this one I'll be using dry sanding. So that's the whole shell, all guide coated inside and out. And there's a couple of reasons why I've guide coated everything. For example, areas like this on a large panel, any imperfections will actually show on the guide coat, so I know whether to block it down a bit more or there's any repairs needed. And areas like in the back here where I've guide coated everything, this is just so I know which areas I've already sanded, as it's very difficult to see what you're doing without a guide coat. All the primer that I've put on this car needs to be keyed up ready for paint. So that's the roof area pretty much done. I've just used the DA sander with an interface pad and some 800 grit. And then down the sides, I've been doing these areas here by hand using a block. And if you're doing a project like this and you're at this stage, I know what you're thinking, not more rubbing down and prep work. But here's the thing, at this stage, when you're flatting the primer down, the next stage is painting. So this has to be spot on, or as best as you can get it. And I don't want to scare you too much, but you can actually stuff this part of the job up. A lot of it is due to the misuse of, say, a sanding block and putting in tram lines into the primer. If you do manage to tilt the sanding block, you're not using it totally flat, you can put lines in the primer. This will actually show in the paint. So the trick is to use your DA sander with an interface pad, keep everything totally flat against the panel, along with your rubbing block. Use it at 45 degrees when you're rubbing. Just make sure everything is totally flat when you're working. Any imperfections that you see will be seen in the paint. For example, if you found a dent and you left it there, you'll end up with a shiny dent. And on a panel like this rear quarter, what I'd do is I'd start off with the DA sander. Where the panel is curved here, I don't try and go up, right up into the corners there. I do this area here by hand, and I also do the sides by hand. I don't take the DA right to the edge, as this edge here and on the front here is going to be thinner on the primer. So it's pretty tricky for me to explain exactly what I'm doing. So I'm just going to do this area here. First of all, I'm just going to DA sand the larger part of this panel. And then what I'm going to do is by hand, using a block, I'm going to do the curved areas and then around the edges. And what you should end up with is a very nice, clean, flat panel with no imperfections. Any black areas in the guide coat, they could need extra repairs, or you may be able to rub a bit further just to delete them. But this panel's actually looking okay so far. So at this point, I've still got a lot of panels to prep ready for paint, but the primer has just turned up, which is great. It means that I can put a couple of coats of primer on the inside of that bonnet. So the inside of the bonnet is prepped and pretty much ready to go. I just need to do my degreasing and then I can go on with the primer. So for many years, when I used to rub down primer ready for paint, I just used to use the wet flatting technique. It was many years later that I switched to dry flatting. So when preparing panels ready for paint and you're rubbing down the primer, there are two methods really. One of them is dry flatting, one of them is wet flatting. Wet flatting is just using some wet dry paper and a block and some water, and that is pretty much it. So one of the problems with wet flatting is obviously you'll be using water. Water and paint generally don't go together, and also you may create rust. So you have to make sure everything is clean and dry before the paint goes on. The one thing I did realise with wet flatting, especially if you're in a dusty workshop, for example, if I had to just paint this area here and I wet flatted the panel, the water would stay on the floor. The dust from the floor and the environment would actually stick to the water, so there was actually less dust in the paintwork. The method's pretty much the same. Use a block. This one here is a rubber block, not the foam one that I use for dry flatting. Plenty of water. Make sure that the paper is constantly kept clean. Any bits of grit will actually drag across the primer and cause scratches. So there we go, that's that panel wet flatted. The finish is pretty much the same as the other side where it's nice, flat and clean. So this is pretty much ready for paint. And although I finished this with a block, if you're feeling confident, you can actually use your DA sander and dip it into the water and use that. So there you go, they're my two favourite options for blocking down primer, wet flatting or dry flatting, and both of them have good results. So I think nowadays in modern body shops, they probably don't use a wet flatting technique. It is considered extremely old school. They're more likely to use dust extractors and dry flatting. So if you do decide to do some wet flatting, make sure you have a clean bucket and just use clean water. You don't need anything else. You don't need to put any additives in there or any soap or anything like that. Just clean water. And if you do decide to use the same bucket that you're washing the car with, that contained wash and wax, make sure you thoroughly clean your bucket first. So when you're blocking down your panels over repairs, you may come across tiny little imperfections. I mean, it's very difficult to see here. There's two little dots there. That's actually tiny little pinholes that are in the filler underneath. So to rectify this, you could easily break out the tub of body filler, or you could get something like this here, which is a knifing stopper or fine putty. And what you can do is just put a couple of little blobs over this and then delete them by sanding them back. And these kind of products are available in all different colors and different brands. But to be honest, they're all pretty much of a muchness that I've used in the past. I just plop it on there, and then if you have a memory like a sieve like my one, just put a bit of tape next to it so you can come back once it's dry to delete it. Another thing that's worth mentioning about this stopper and many other stoppers, they're actually a single part. There's no need for hardener. Just pop a tiny bit on there. You can put a glove on and use your finger just to plop a bit on there, or you can just use a tiny little spreader. Another thing with these types of pinholes is that they're not always covered by the paint. You can actually end up with a pinhole in the paint. So just do what you can, try and get rid of as many of these as possible. So another thing about prepping this primer is before the primer came on and we were doing the filler work and keying it up ready for primer, I was using this here, which is a red Scotch, which is quite a coarse Scotch pad. Now I'm using something like this, which is extremely soft. It's equivalent to about a 600 Scotch. And this is great for getting into all these areas where you can't really get into with your paper. So some areas like this window aperture here can be really tricky to sand back. So what I've been using here is the paper with a flap of rubber. This actually allows me to work like this. And what I can do is easily make this flat without having to leave my fingerprints in there. What I mean is that my fingers aren't actually flat like this piece of rubber, and if I was to do this, I would actually leave fingerprint marks in the primer. So when doing this kind of work, flat panels are relatively easy. When it comes to curved panels, they can be a bit more tricky, and what I normally tend to do is just use the block at 45-degree angle and just kind of work around following the contour of the panel. So when dealing with awkwardly shaped panels like wings, the best way to check to make sure your work is okay is to have your hand flat against the panel and then just rub it over there and just see if you can feel any imperfections. Some dents are so fine that they're like ripples that you can't see in the guide coat, but you can certainly feel them with a flat hand. And something that you guys may have noticed is I've actually finally invested in a pair of panel stands, and these are great. I mean, I've got both wings on there and it's easy to work with. They've got foam padding here to stop any damage, and it's pretty rugged. If you do a lot of body work, I'd probably suggest pick up a couple of these panel stands. They're relatively cheap. So if you're dealing with heavily damaged or previously heavily damaged panels like these wings, you will uncover small amounts of imperfections, maybe around the repairs. You can see just here in the guide coat, there's an imperfection here. This is where there was a dent and a filler repair. And things like this can actually be deleted in the primer stage, and I should be able to rub this out. And if you put enough primer on, it's very doable. You can see there that the imperfection has disappeared. So compared to the other stages of the build, the repair work, the body work, the resin primer and the rubbing down and all sorts, this is actually a relatively quick stage in the build. But in the same breath, please don't rush this part. If you get any imperfections, please try and sort them out now, because you'll be kicking yourself when you see them in the paint. So at this point, just take your time, make sure that you've done the best you can with what you've got, and there is light at the end of the tunnel. And the light at the end of the tunnel is knowing that the next stage is the painting. But I've got a bit of a problem. I did order the paint. I actually ordered the paint on Christmas Day of all days, and there has been a bit of a problem. The current manufacturer is unable to mix the paint for me to my specifications, so I'm having to go for another paint company. So hopefully I'll hear back from them soon, because I need to get this into paint ASAP. So if you're attempting a build like this and you're in primer and you're blocking it down, congratulations. You're actually kind of getting near the finish line regarding the bodywork stage of your build. And at this point, although I've managed to almost break the back on rubbing down all that primer, I've still got quite a bit to do, so I'm going to get on with it now. Thanks as always for tuning in. See you next time. Cheers!